Thanks so much. I was so deep in listening to what you were both saying that I'm still gathering myself to think about what I actually want to speak about. Thanks very much for having me here. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the sovereign land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to elders past and present, to my Aboriginal colleagues in this movement for their leadership. So I think we all have about 10 minutes to speak. I also, like Ray, can speak really swiftly, so I'm going to try to sort of say about 5 things at a pace that is understandable as well. And first up, I'd like to really acknowledge both the synergies and the tensions that emerge across work to tackle interpersonal gendered violence and systemic and state-based gendered violence. I think at the heart of the work absolutely is an ethic of safety and community organising. However, work to tackle family violence, including work that takes place and has taken place here in Victoria, has often built relationships with and advocated for the role of police and prisons without real critique and acknowledgement of their inherent violence, the harms that they entail, and the ways that building relationships with them actually serves to enshrine and legitimise their role, and often confuses accountability with punishment in the ways that we talk about violence and responses. But also to note at the same time that there are very real challenges in identifying and building mechanisms for safety and interventions to family violence and harm that don't rely on the prison industrial complex, and that this work is very much ongoing and that it's movement work. So I wanted to situate what I have to say kind of in that location. And also to reiterate what was just mentioned, that I think that this engagement with police and prisons, including at the response end of the family violence sector, absolutely raises really specific challenges for the PVAW sector in thinking about what relationships are built with those institutions. So I'll be speaking kind of quite specifically about policing, even though I want to situate that in the context of a police to prison pipeline that's very much live in Victoria at the moment. And firstly, I wanted to locate this conversation in a post-Royal Commission into family violence context. So we all know that we're working in this post-Royal Commission environment. In going through the many, many submissions that went into the Royal Commission from the family violence sector and others, there was a huge amount of kind of call for police to be centred as first responders to family violence. There were absolutely some critical submissions that went in that talked about police responses, but these very much focused up the reform end. They talked about things like training for police. And what we saw then in the recommendations from the Royal Commission and then the associated funding was a huge amount of resources flowing to supporting and expanding the role of police as first responders. Extensions of powers, extensions to weaponry, absolutely a huge expansion of resources and funding. What we didn't see was any associated resources applied for accountability or evaluation or looking at the lived experiences of how family violence is actually policed in Victoria. And adequately tracking and responding to the harm of the ways that family violence is policed in Victoria is not a new kind of challenge or sector gap. It's something that's been a gap for some time. And part of what we're doing at the Police Accountability Project in conjunction with Flat Out, with Tarneen and with others is working to respond to the ways that family violence is actually being policed in a post-Royal Commission context. What we're noticing already are some really key trends in the harms and issues related to family violence policing. These are things like absolutely racialised and discriminatory policing. We're seeing predatory or violent behaviour by police. I want to acknowledge also that all of this occurs in the sort of opaque context of a police complaint system in Victoria, where the overwhelming majority of complaints about police are still self-investigated by police. So we're talking about an organisation that kind of then looks inward when there are complaints about the ways that it polices. We're seeing a failure to enforce intervention orders. We're seeing issues around the misidentification of survivors. I know that there's been a 40% increase in the number of women listed as respondents on police-initiated intervention orders since the Royal Commission, so it's a huge spike in police identifying women as perpetrators. And then what we're seeing is the criminalisation of survivors. So that includes criminalisation of people experiencing violence when police are called out to those crisis incidents. And of course, we're seeing all of this in interaction with the racialised crime panic that's been happening in Victoria. So and what that means for kind of punitive law and order reform. So mandatory sentencing, changes to bail laws, everything that Ray and Tarneen have spoken about 5 minutes, in great and articulate detail in terms of looking at the prison system also as a form of gendered violence. And one of the things that we note in the Police Accountability Project is this tension, and particularly a framing tension, in whether these issues are understood, particularly when it comes to policing, as a case of kind of bad apples, or whether we understand it as structural and systemic gendered violence. And every time we elevate, kind of one of these issues, or something might break in the news, we see police get out there and they do a press conference and they talk about it being a one-off or a situation where a particular officer needs to be trained. We take the opposite view, and we absolutely believe that these are inherent and systemic systems of gendered violence. And to locate it, to talk about it from a PVAW perspective, I maybe don't know how to... That's not me. I buggered it up, sorry. But I wanted to talk for a little, just very briefly, about the kind of framework that we consider when we are talking about preventing violence. I'll go to the second one. Just to that. Thank you. And I wanted to take just pull up one particular visual, which is the second slide, that locates... Maybe it won't work. Yeah. Great. So on the left, obviously, there's an Our Watch Change the Story image, and on the right, what we've got is some coverage of the Take a Stand campaign. So Victoria's most powerful men declare war on family violence. So it's a classic visual that talks about a kind of zero tolerance, criminalising approach to tackling violence against women. It's something that our sector in various ways has absolutely endorsed and continues to endorse. So what I want to talk about is that enormous tension between what might happen at the response end in the name of safety and what's happening when we're talking about gendered drivers of violence. Secondly, I'm going to have a go at this. Nope. Can you move me to the next one? I also wanted to talk about this kind of claim of bad apples versus what we consider to be an inherent hypermasculine and militarised culture that exists in Victoria Police. We hear about this every day from people experiencing violence. And I think one of the insights that's offered into Victoria Police culture are the two inquiries that the Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission have run, one looking into sexual harassment in Victoria Police and one looking into homophobia and transphobia in Victoria Police. Both of these, there's some quotes up there, but both of these found unequivocally an entrenched culture of everyday sexism coupled with a high tolerance for sexual harassment, and also an entrenched culture of homophobia in Victoria Police and a prevailing culture of masculinity and heteronormativity. So we're talking about institutions that embody the very drivers of the violence that we say we're working to prevent. And so that, I think, is a fundamental challenge in terms of our engagement with them. I know I'm nearly at the end. I have two more things to say. One thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to talk specifically about the ways that we understand the intersection between interpersonal and state-sanctioned violence against women. Ray touched on this really beautifully as well, but one thing I notice in the sector is our kind of prevailing language that still, including in a risk assessment space, tends to talk about things like vulnerability and structural barriers, rather than understanding that the intersection of interpersonal and state-sanctioned gendered violence happens in a really deliberate way. We know that in relationships where someone using violence or abuse exerts power and control, that person absolutely capitalises on systems of oppression in the ways that they perpetrate violence. So the family violence will be ableist, it will be racist, it will absolutely use those systemic structures of oppression in the ways that violence is perpetrated. And if we continue to use language like vulnerability, particularly when we talk about people experiencing violence, then we continue to locate those experiences of oppression in the individual rather than in the structures and the systems that actually are being used and exerted against somebody. And I wanted to conclude by basically kind of touching on a couple of the fundamental challenges that this throws up for our work. I think one of the core challenges that it throws up is a question around our engagement with these institutions when we choose to leverage them and when we make assumptions about either police or prisons as sites of safety. I've got a couple of specific examples. One of them, I think, is in the push to increasingly train and resource those organisations to provide specialist family violence support, particularly to women who are criminalised. So an example would be family violence services training corrections staff to undertake CRAF risk assessment and to provide family violence support when those same corrections officers are the staff who will then be strip searching women who are held in prison, given everything that we know about who's in prison and the experiences of violence of those women who are held in prison. So that's probably one of those kind of like really clear pinnacle examples of what it means to be sort of trying to train organisations that harm people to then actually do specialist family violence work as well. Can I get you to flip through? The last thing that I wanted to say is that, just to conclude with a kind of comment around whether there are opportunities for the PVOR sector, I think Ray already kind of covered this in the call to action, but I do want to note that I think fundamentally we need violence prevention strategies and analysis that address both gendered, interpersonal, family violence and state violence, and a gendered analysis of violence prevention should and must also guide the way that we actually engage with structures that perpetuate these drivers. And finally, that we need to centre the people who are most likely to be harmed by these institutions in all of our responses and actually listen to and support and foster their leadership in doing so. Thanks.